In early August 2022, 29-year-old Lily Lindsay strode out of a nail salon in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, feeling especially polished. Usually, she did her own nails with an at-home gel manicure kit, but today, she'd gotten her nails done at a fancy salon, and she had even paid extra for eyebrow threading. Lily had really spent a lot of money over the past week to make herself as beautiful as possible. Her best friend's wedding was in 2 days, and Lily really wanted to look absolutely perfect for the photos. To Lily, looking her absolute best was another way of showing her friend how excited she was for her big day. Lily ran through a short mental checklist of everything she still had to get done before the wedding. She needed to pick up her dress from the tailor and get decorations and snacks for the bridal suite. But before she could do any of that, she had one more appointment. She was getting a facial. Lily decided to grab an iced coffee on her way to the spa. She walked a few doors down from the nail salon to a little cafe on the corner. And as she walked in, she caught a glimpse of herself in the store window, and she couldn't help but smile, because she was beautiful and elegant, and so she could barely wait to see how amazing she would look with her full hair done and makeup and her dress on. It had been hectic helping her best friend bring the wedding together, but she could not be more excited for the weekend ahead. The wedding would end up being even more incredible than Lily had hoped, and she had really high expectations. And 10 days later, Lily still felt like she was recovering from it. She stumbled from her bed to her bathroom, stretching her arms high overhead to try and wake up. She yawned, and she could feel the skin around her mouth start to crack a bit, which seemed strange for summertime. Her skin had not felt this tight and dry since midwinter, when the cold and high winds left her whole face feeling chapped. Lily went to grab her toothbrush, but when she saw herself in the mirror, she stopped. The skin under her eyes was blotchy and red. She leaned in toward the mirror for a better look and traced the outline of the rash with one of her fingers. She'd never had a skin outbreak like this before. Lily opened up her medicine cabinet and looked at the array of skincare products inside. She'd used most of the products for months or even years, but now she wondered if maybe she'd developed an allergic reaction to one of them. So she decided to skip her skincare routine for a few days to see if maybe that would clear up the irritated skin. But Lily's rash didn't get any better. And after 2 weeks of eliminating different face products to see if that helped, she found herself on an examination table at a doctor's office. At this point, she'd stopped using every face serum she owned, but still had not been able to identify what was making her skin break out. In the last few days, her rash had spread across her face and down her neck. The red splotches itched and would sting if she tried to cover them with makeup, so she had to leave the rashes exposed, which made her sort of embarrassed in public. Lily winced as the doctor gently tapped his finger all along her rash. He was being very gentle, but still it burned every time he touched her, almost like salt touching a wound. The doctor stood up and told her not to worry. He'd seen cases like this a dozen times. It was standard-issue dermatitis, which meant a skin irritation, usually caused by an environmental factor like air pollution or exposure to a new allergen. He was confident that an antibiotic would clear her face up in no time. Lily was so relieved. She'd never had particularly sensitive skin, so she was surprised to learn that all of this boiled down to skin irritation, but she was just glad to have a diagnosis and a plan of action. She told the doctor she'd stop at the pharmacy on the way home and grab the antibiotic. A month after Lily's initial visit to her doctor, she was in her room getting ready for a follow-up appointment. She carefully peeled off her pajamas and put on wide-leg jeans and a baggy shirt. These were unfortunately the only clothes she could stand to wear these days, because the rest of her wardrobe fit too snugly and rubbed against her raw skin, which was still totally broken out and incredibly painful. The antibiotics had not worked. Her skin still felt crusty, her lips were so dry that they split every time she laughed. Big blotchy rashes covered her face and neck as well as down her chest and beneath her armpits. They were so painful that Lily often tried to keep her arms raised slightly whenever she walked around, usually with her hands on her hips to avoid chafing. Showering had also become excruciatingly painful. She'd started skipping it as much as she could, which made her feel totally dirty. As Lily walked out the door this time, she hoped this appointment would finally lead her to some answers. She didn't know how much more skin irritation she could take. 30 minutes later, Lily parked her car at the doctor's office and made her way across the parking lot, keeping the hood of her jacket over her head to obscure her face. She knew it was superficial, but she still felt embarrassed to let people see all her blotchy and flaky skin. As Lily checked in with the receptionist and headed into an exam room, she tried not to make eye contact with anybody in the office. As she changed into a hospital gown, she thought how repulsed people would be if they saw her undressed. When the doctor finally entered the exam room a few minutes later, his eyes widened a bit, and Lily knew he was shocked by her appearance. He quickly recovered and acted totally professional, but Lily couldn't help feeling totally ashamed as he asked her about the rash and inspected it on different areas of her body. After a few minutes, the doctor told her that, in his opinion, this seemed like a flare-up of eczema, which is a term for chronically inflamed skin. It's like an extreme case of dermatitis, which is what he'd originally diagnosed her with. But antibiotics don't work against eczema, which is why she was not improving. But he told her not to panic because a steroid cream would clear it up in no time. A few months later, in January of 2023, Lily sat on her couch as a winter storm raged outside. The steroid cream had also not worked. If anything, it only seemed to make her breakout worse. At this point, her skin, in total, was actually more rash than clear. Lily had spent the last few months going to all sorts of doctors. They were all sympathetic to her problem, but ultimately had been unable to help her. It was unbelievably frustrating. Lily felt trapped in her own skin, like she was in a cage she couldn't escape. In fact, Lily's skin troubles had gotten so bad, it was totally affecting her mental health. Her thoughts were starting to get really dark and pessimistic, so she'd gone to a therapist for help. The therapist had prescribed her a low dose of antidepressants, which were helping with some of Lily's racing thoughts and feelings of hopelessness, but they were obviously not a cure for the entire situation she was in. At this point, even if she felt mentally okay, physically she was in so much pain all the time that she couldn't even leave the sofa. So tonight, Lily had wrapped herself in a fuzzy blanket, the only one that didn't scratch at her skin, and ordered herself a pizza. Lily decided to watch a movie, but when she got up to grab the remote, she felt blood rushing to her head and her vision began spinning. Lily eased back onto the couch and closed her eyes, feeling so dizzy it made her nauseous. Then suddenly her ears began to ring, and her chest tightened as she tried to fight back anxious tears. She knew that dizziness and ear ringing were not symptoms of eczema, and so she couldn't help but start wondering if she was actually going to die. This was the final straw. Lily could not just sit around and wait for death, and if the doctors couldn't help, she would just have to solve this puzzle herself. So she slowly got up and very painfully walked over to grab her laptop because now it was time for her to conduct her own research. A few hours later, Lily was crouched over her computer, poring over an article she'd found online. It discussed the symptoms of extreme allergic reactions, and to Lily's surprise, many of her symptoms fit. This entire ordeal really did seem like one big allergic reaction. But Lily still had no idea what she might be allergic to. So she started looking up common allergies, until she found a couple that sounded like hers. She discovered that some people are actually extremely allergic to the latex from the balloons that she had actually used during her friend's wedding to create custom arrangements. Now, Lily had never had a problem with latex before, but the article said that allergies could develop later in life. She also found that home nail polish kits, like the ones she used, can cause allergies too, as the chemicals seep into people's bodies through the nail bed. Lily started thinking that surely there must be a way to test whether these chemicals were making her break out so horribly. And so for the first time in 5 months, Lily felt like she kind of had a plan here, and so hope began to spark inside of her. She would call her doctor first thing in the morning, and hopefully they could, together, get to the bottom of this thing once and for all. A few days later, on a Friday afternoon, Lily sat on an allergist's examination table with her hands on her knees. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her rash-covered back was fully exposed. She winced as her doctor taped a bunch of small patches to her back. To Lily, the patches looked like little strips of bubble wrap, but actually, they were allergy patch test strips, and each of the little bubbles contained a different allergen. Lily clenched her jaw. The strips were already beginning to itch, partially because they were stuck to her rash, which was sensitive already, and partially because they'd stuck more than 200 chemical samples to her back, including latex and the chemicals from her at-home nail kit. So she was bound to be allergic to at least a few of these things. When the doctor finished his work, he explained to Lily that unfortunately, she would have to leave all of these test strips on her back all weekend, no matter how much they irritated her. She nodded, though she was absolutely dreading the discomfort the next few days would bring. But she told herself that if she could just push through to Monday, she would almost certainly have an answer, and then this nightmare could finally be over. By Monday morning, when Lily drove her car into the doctor's office parking lot, she wanted to rip those test strips off her back and light them on fire. It had been the most miserable weekend of her life. The only thing that had gotten her through the very itchy discomfort was knowing that each little sting she was feeling was a positive reaction to an allergen and a possible answer to her problems. As she strode into the doctor's office, her clothes billowed all around her because she could only wear really baggy clothes, and there were bags under her eyes because she hadn't slept well either, so she was quite the sight. But Lily prayed that it would all be over soon, because in a few short minutes, she would know exactly what was causing this excruciating rash. Except that's not what happened. Lily's doctor peeled off all the patches and explained that he could only see a few mild allergic reactions, but nothing that could cause a reaction this bad all over her body. Lily couldn't understand. Her symptoms had matched an extreme allergic reaction perfectly, especially to latex or the at-home nail gel. She was so sure she was on the right track, and now she just felt defeated. Lily drove home in a stupor. She felt like her life was now this living hell. She thought back to the previous summer, mad at herself for not appreciating how good her life used to be. She'd give anything to go back to the day of her best friend's wedding and just look like her old self again. She ran her tongue over the veneers she'd gotten for the wedding. Her smile was the only part of her physical appearance that she liked now, but she would give it up in a second to get her old skin back. But just then, a thought hit her like a lightning bolt, and she actually pulled her car over so quickly that the tires screeched. Once she came to a stop, she immediately began rifling through her purse for her phone, and as her heart raced, she thought to herself she'd been going to the wrong doctor. That was the issue, and now she desperately needed to make an appointment with the right one. 2 days later, Lily sat in her dentist chair. She told him that in her quest to look perfect for her friend's wedding, she suspected that she had accidentally set herself up for months of misery. She was just sure she had discovered the cause of her extreme rash. When the dentist looked skeptical, Lily told him about the article she'd found online about extreme allergies. And suddenly, the dentist understood too. Lily had a strong suspicion that her problems had all been caused by the gels in her at-home nail kit. But it was more complicated than that. In fact, the online article Lily read talked about the way nail gels can make people dangerously allergic to other everyday things. That's because the acrylic-based plastic in the gel can seep into someone's nail bed and make them allergic to anything else that contains acrylic. In Lily's case, that would be the veneers she had applied to her teeth to look beautiful for the wedding. The veneers were loaded with acrylic-based plastic, and her body had a very powerful reaction to it. Essentially, Lily had poison glued to her front teeth for the last 6 months, which triggered a constant, severe allergic reaction. Ultimately, the dentist ground the veneers off of Lily's teeth in April of 2023, and slowly but surely, the rash became less painful. By the summer of 2023, Lily's skin was back to normal, and she felt like herself again. There's really no way to know for sure whether the at-home gel manicure kit had triggered her allergy, but either way, Lily has steered clear of them ever since. Here is our second and final story called No Warning. On the morning of August 15th, 2020, 16-year-old Rohan Gadhania stood in his kitchen mixing up a protein shake. He was trying to put on some muscle before school started in a few weeks. Rohan took a sip and grimaced. The shake was thick and chalky, which he just was not expecting because he did not often drink protein shakes. But Rohan was never one to back down from a challenge, so he adjusted his glasses and steeled himself, then gulped the whole shake down. When he was done, he slammed the glass down on the counter in triumph. He told himself he was going to learn to like those shakes because he was going to get jacked. Rohan put the dirty glass in the dishwasher, then bounded up the stairs to his bedroom on the second floor, already feeling stronger. In truth, he was a very skinny kid, especially for his age. And even though Rohan knew he had a lot going for him, good grades, a bright future, a very winning personality, he really wanted big muscles, or at least to weigh more than a 12-year-old. Rohan opened the door to his bedroom and made a beeline for his piano keyboard. Rohan was a very accomplished musician and loved practicing just about every day. But this morning, he stopped himself and instead turned toward the Nintendo Wii game system hooked up to the television on top of his dresser. He grabbed the Wii remote and began browsing through Wii Fit games until he came to strength training. Rohan thought that if he started right now and kept on sucking down those protein shakes, maybe he really could build some actual muscle by the time classes resumed. At lunchtime, Rohan's father, Hitendra, made sandwiches for the two of them and then called Rohan to the kitchen table. But while Hitendra wolfed his meal down in about 4 bites, he noticed that his son barely touched his food. Rohan told him his stomach hurt, and Hitendra just nodded, understanding. He told his son it was fine if he didn't want to finish his lunch, and encouraged Rohan to go lie down and take a nap. Hopefully that would settle his stomach. Rohan smiled at his father and then left the kitchen. Once the boy was gone, Hitendra picked up Rohan's plate and began to tidy up. But then he heard the distinct sound of dry heaving coming from the upstairs bathroom. Hitendra dropped the plates into the sink and hurried upstairs to check on Rohan, who he found kneeling over the toilet. Rohan retched repeatedly as his father rubbed his back reassuringly. Then Hitendra suggested Rohan stay in bed for the rest of the day. It seemed like he must have picked up some kind of stomach bug. Once Rohan was in his bed with a waste can nearby just in case, Hitendra went back downstairs and found the protein powder he'd gotten for Rohan. It was the only unusual thing Rohan had eaten over the past couple of days, and Hitendra wondered if it had gone bad or had some strange ingredients in it. Hitendra scanned the label, and he saw the expiration date was not for a while, and none of the ingredients stood out to him as unusual or alarming, so he shrugged and put the protein powder back where it went in the cupboard, convinced his son would feel better by morning. But when Hitendra went to check on Rohan the next morning, the boy was as white as a sheet. Rohan admitted he'd vomited a few times overnight and that he felt even worse than the day before. The boy propped himself up in bed, squinting. Hitendra thought his son might be looking for his glasses, so Hitendra told Rohan they were on the nightstand. Rohan nodded slowly, but then he started looking around the room as if he didn't know where to find his own nightstand. Hitendra frowned and just pointed at the nightstand, and Rohan's face suddenly lit up as though he was pleasantly surprised to even find a table there. Now, Hitendra couldn't help but feel more concern for his son. He wondered if Rohan was so dehydrated that he was confused. So he helped Rohan downstairs and sat him at the kitchen table while he went to grab a bottle of the sports drink they always kept in the pantry. But when Hitendra returned to the kitchen carrying his son's drink, his son suddenly seemed even stranger. Rohan glared at his father with utter contempt. When Hitendra asked if everything was okay, Rohan snapped that his father should mind his own business. Then Rohan got up so aggressively that the table shook. Then Rohan just stood there staring icily at his father. This was very unlike Rohan, and so Hitendra knew something had to be deeply wrong. Rohan was so gentle normally, but now he was erratic and aggressive and confused. Hitendra knew his son needed to see a doctor, but something told him it was just not safe to try to take Rohan to the hospital by himself right now, like not in this state, something was terribly wrong. So to play it very safe, Hitendra just called an ambulance. A few hours later, Rohan's mother, Pushpa, arrived at West Middlesex Hospital, where the paramedics had taken her son. She kept telling herself that Rohan would be just fine, but Pushpa still felt incredibly anxious as she entered the hospital lobby. Her husband, Hitendra, met her in the hallway outside of Rohan's room and explained that Rohan had become increasingly agitated on his way to the hospital, and he kept trying to get up and move around the ambulance on the way, and Hitendra actually had to physically restrain him on the stretcher to keep him from jumping out the back doors. Pushpa just blinked in surprise at this incredibly strange turn of events. Rohan was just not the type of boy to fly into a rage, let alone leap out of a moving vehicle, and so fear began creeping into Pushpa's mind, much the way it had already creeped into Hitendra's mind. And so Pushpa followed Hitendra into Rohan's hospital room, hoping to find Rohan back to himself and feeling better, but instead, Rohan was sitting up in bed, hunched over a kidney-shaped bowl and vomiting. Pushpa felt instant sympathy for her son as she watched him throw up, but that wasn't the worst of it. There were tubes hooked up to Rohan's arms, and wires patched to his chest, leading to all sorts of whirring and beeping machines. Whatever was wrong with Rohan was clearly more serious than just the flu or some other minor ailment. Pushpa looked back at Hitendra, whose eyes were full of concern. Hitendra explained that Rohan had been deteriorating ever since they arrived at the hospital, and the doctors still had no idea what was making Rohan sick. Rohan was complaining of intense abdominal pain and kept forgetting where he was or how he'd even gotten there. Suddenly, the knot in Pushpa's chest tightened and her breathing quickened as she grappled with what Hitendra was saying. And so, kind of panicking, she just stepped out into the hallway and let out a scream of absolute despair. Her son was falling apart before her eyes, and there wasn't anything she could do. She felt so hopeless. Pushpa bent over and braced her hands on her knees, sucking in long breaths of air. When she finally felt like she had collected herself, she went back into the hospital room and planted a kiss on Rohan's forehead. She told her son everything was going to be fine, even though inside she didn't know that. Then she stood next to Hitendra, gripping his hand tightly. Over the next few hours, Pushpa and Hitendra paced the hospital room as their son alternated between moments of confusion and extreme agitation. All the while, doctors and nurses came in and out, explaining all the tests and treatments they were doing to try to figure out what was wrong. The doctors said that they suspected that Rohan was suffering from some kind of inflammation around the spinal column and brain, and so they started him on medication right away for the two most likely conditions, which were meningitis and encephalopathy. For a little while, Rohan did seem to get better with the medication. But just before midnight, he started to get restless and agitated again, and he began trying to jump out of the bed, which would have torn out all the wires and IV lines. And so Hitendra did his best to hold the teenager down, while Pushpa repeatedly pressed the call button for help. A moment later, two nurses were in Rohan's room, attaching restraints to Rohan's wrists so that he couldn't get out of bed. A doctor said that Rohan was getting too unstable to remain in a regular hospital room, and he directed the nurses to move him to the intensive care unit. Pushpa was shocked. She knew Rohan was sick, but she still couldn't believe his condition had gotten this bad, and so she had to fight to hold in another scream. The nurse said that Rohan would be sedated once he got upstairs, and he would likely be asleep for hours. She urged Pushpa and Hitendra to go home for the night and then come back rested in the morning. Pushpa hated the idea of leaving her son, but she also knew that he'd be under close watch in the ICU without them. And if Rohan was going to be in the hospital for a few days, she and Hitendra would need some sleep. So they followed the medical team to the ICU, and they stayed with their son until he fell asleep, and then after kissing their boy goodnight, the parents headed home. When they got there, Pushpa threw on some pajamas and crawled into bed, but she felt like she was not going to be able to sleep. She just stared at the ceiling, thinking of her son, and she would lay there, her thoughts racing, until about 5 a.m., when her phone started ringing. It was the hospital. The doctor explained that Rohan's condition had actually taken another serious turn for the worse over the night. Rohan was now struggling so hard to breathe that he had to be intubated and put on a ventilator, which meant that a machine was now keeping him alive. Absolutely shocked and terrified, Pushpa shook Hitendra awake, and then she ran to wake up their 17-year-old daughter, Alicia, and then the three of them threw on their shoes and raced to the hospital. By the time they arrived, Rohan's doctor was there to meet them. The doctor admitted that they were struggling to get Rohan stabilized, but he was not actually in immediate danger. Once he was stable, they planned to do another CT scan so they'd have a better picture of what was going on in his brain. Pushpa felt like she was going to faint, so she sank into one of the chairs that lined the pale blue hallway of the ICU. She was vaguely aware that Hitendra and Alicia had sat down on either side of her, and each had taken one of her hands. After the doctor left, Hitendra squeezed Pushpa's hand and reminded her that while all of this sounded terrifying, Rohan was in good hands here. Pushpa wanted to believe that, but the drumbeat of bad news over and over and over again was making it hard for her to be optimistic. Pushpa sat tensely by Rohan's bed for the entire day, willing her boy to get better. Rohan's doctor came to check in every few hours, assuring them that Rohan would get his CT scan once he was stable enough. And then finally, in the late afternoon, technicians were able to perform that CT scan of Rohan's brain. And then, around 6 p.m., Rohan's doctor slowly walked into his room, staring at the floor. The doctor took a deep breath and looked Pushpa in the eye. He told her that Rohan had severe swelling in his brain, which can be fatal if it's not controlled. The doctor said he had already called the neurosurgery department at nearby Charing Cross Hospital, but the team there had said they could not, in good conscience, operate on Rohan to relieve the pressure. Given the extent of his brain injury and meningitis, they were not confident he would survive the surgery. Pushpa struggled to understand what the doctor was even saying, that essentially her son was too far gone to help. She hadn't even considered this possibility. Her boy was only 16 years old. Despite all her worry over the past few days, she had fully believed her son would eventually get better. He had to. Pushpa told the doctor he had to be wrong, but the look on the man's face said everything. Her boy was beyond helping. The following evening, on August 18th, Pushpa sat on the edge of Rohan's bed, her hand wrapped around his. Rohan lay motionless, still intubated and hooked up to IVs and machines. Hitendra and Rohan's sister, Alicia, sat nervously on the other side of Rohan's bed. Rohan's doctor was leaning over him, essentially checking the teen for signs of life. He stood and slowly turned to Pushpa and her family. He looked truly sad as he said that Rohan showed no brain activity. Then he said he would give them time to say their goodbyes, and he left the room. Pushpa stroked her son's hand, still unable to accept what was happening. Alicia tucked a teddy bear under Rohan's arms. He'd had it since he was a baby, and still slept with it every night in the corner of his bed. The whole family knew he'd want his bear to be with him now. For the rest of the afternoon, the family sat in silence as they struggled to say goodbye to Rohan. And then finally, at 5:03 p.m., Rohan passed away, and Pushpa's heart shattered. But her family did not get much time to grieve, only a few minutes. A doctor entered the room and asked Pushpa and Hitendra to consider donating Rohan's organs. He apologized for how quickly they'd need to make this decision, but organs need to be harvested for transplant as soon after death as possible. The doctor knew it was small consolation, but he said that Rohan's death could very likely save other lives. The doctor then held out some lengthy forms. The idea of filling out paperwork in the same hour that her young son died was repulsive to Pushpa. But she understood, and she knew what decision Rohan would have made. And so she and Hitendra took the forms and agreed to donate Rohan's organs. A few weeks later, Pushpa sat in Rohan's bedroom back at their home outside of London, holding his teddy bear to her chest. It was the only one of his belongings that she'd touched since her son had died. The grief of losing a child was almost more than she could bear, and since his death, something else had really been eating at her. Pushpa still didn't even know what had made Rohan sick, and because they had donated his organs, there hadn't been time to conduct an autopsy, and so she was really struggling to accept that she'd just never learned what had killed him. Pushpa worried that if what had killed Rohan was something genetic or environmental, his sister Alicia might also be at risk. But more than anything, she wanted to know if something could have been done to save Rohan. It just felt like this huge question mark was looming over her family's head, occupying every waking thought. 13 months after Rohan's death, so in September of 2021, Hitendra ignored Pushpa's running commentary on his wild driving as he weaved in and out of traffic. They were on the way home from Alicia's university. They'd just finished moving her into the dorms for the fall semester, which felt even more bittersweet than Hitendra had anticipated. He and Pushpa were empty nesters now, but only because Rohan was gone. Hitendra did not want to go home and cook a dinner for just 2 people. He was about to bring up the possibility of maybe going out to a restaurant when Pushpa's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but for some reason, the hair on the back of Hitendra's neck pricked up, and he told Pushpa to please answer it. And so Pushpa did, and she connected her phone to the car speaker so they could both listen. The man on the other line sounded grim. He explained that he was from the National Health Service blood and transplant team, the people who harvested their son's organs for transplant. Hitendra exchanged a quick, surprised glance with Pushpa as this man went on. The man said they needed Pushpa and Hitendra to come into the office for an urgent meeting. Hitendra was confused, but offered to drive straight to the office. They could be there within the hour. The man said that would be great and thanked them. Hitendra felt more curious than alarmed, so he pushed the gas pedal a bit faster as Pushpa reset the GPS to their new destination. What Pushpa and Hitendra learned at this meeting absolutely shocked them. The National Health Service team member explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver had become gravely ill earlier that year. A biopsy on the liver that had come from Rohan revealed a very dangerous condition with a very complicated name. It's called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, or OTCD for short. OTCD is a genetic condition that prevents the body from breaking down ammonia, which can cause the toxic chemical to build up to lethal levels in the bloodstream. The man explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver didn't have OTCD before his transplant surgery, so the illness had to come from the donated liver, Rohan's liver. And so the team member told the parents that their son almost certainly suffered from OTCD. Finally, 13 months after Rohan had passed away, his parents knew what had actually killed him. Pushpa and Hitendra stared at each other in disbelief. They were relieved to get some answers, but they didn't know anything about OTCD and why it would have suddenly killed Rohan like that, and so they asked for more information. The NHS team member explained that some people with OTCD don't even know they have it because the disease is inactive. However, the illness can be triggered by a big dose of protein. And in Rohan's case, he had drank a huge protein shake on the morning he got sick. He'd never consumed so much protein before so quickly, and his body basically couldn't handle it. And so that's what prompted him to get sick. Pushpa and Hitendra were obviously devastated. If they'd only known about Rohan's kind of inactive condition, they would have never let him drink protein shakes like that. Now, could that have forever prevented him from getting the disease? They don't know. But certainly, that protein shake is what prompted it. Thankfully, though, it does not seem likely that their daughter has OTCD, which affects an estimated 1,000 people in the United Kingdom alone. More studies are being conducted on OTCD, but as far as we know, it is extremely dangerous, killing about 50% of infants diagnosed with it at birth, and around 10% of people diagnosed with it when they're 16 or older, which was Rohan's age. However, there were no warnings that the protein powder that Rohan ingested could trigger this terrible disease. Rohan's experience ultimately prompted calls for new warnings to be printed on all supermarket-bought protein shakes in the UK. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella wrapped up her first year in college and headed home for the summer. Her family lived just outside of this small town in France that was tucked up in the mountains and surrounded by this huge forest. And so growing up, Bella spent a lot of her time out in this forest, either by herself or with her father or other members of her family. And so she knew the forest like the back of her hand. Her favorite place to go in this forest was the man-made lake that sat kind of at the center of this forest. It wasn't huge, but it was a beautiful view, it was very peaceful, and so she liked going out there. The way she would get to it is she would leave her house, she would hop in her car, she would drive a couple of miles down the road, and she would pull off into the shoulder of this road, and there was no signage that said this was the pull-off to get to the man-made lake. This was an area that she and her family had discovered, that there was this particular trail you could take. And so she would pull off at this shoulder, she would get out, and she would turn away from the road and just walk directly into the trees, which butted right up against the road. And very quickly, after walking into the woods, after going through some thick underbrush, she would reach this kind of clearing and she would see up ahead this little stream. And off to the left side of this stream is what looked like this kind of beaten up little footpath, but actually what it was an animal trail. So animals just kind of made their way around this area all the time, and so it kind of carved out a path. And so Bella would walk down to this animal path, and she would walk along the path that kind of went parallel with the stream, and she would walk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes until this animal path veered hard to the left, kind of went away from the stream. At that point, Bella would abandon the animal path and just continue walking along this stream, both stepping in the stream on some rocks and standing on either side when she could. And she would follow this stream due north, just going straight into the heart of this forest for about an hour, walking at a fairly leisurely pace until the stream connected with this east to west running river. And at this point, Bella would turn left, facing west, and she would follow along this riverbank about 20 minutes until the river fed into the man-made lake. And so she would stay at this lake, sitting on a rock, enjoy the view and look at the animals and listen to nature all around her. And then at some point she would turn around and retrace her steps all the way back to her car. For reference, one leg of this journey from car to lake or from lake to car took about 2 hours. Part of the reason Bella really enjoyed being in these woods and being at this lake was because it just kind of felt like they were hers. Because up until this summer in 2019, the only other people that Bella had ever seen anywhere in this forest or near this lake were other members of her family. So it really felt very private. So in June of that year, Bella comes home from college, and almost immediately she wants to go out to the man-made lake because she hasn't been in months. She's been in school, and so she's eager to get back to some place that she kind of considered to be her happy place. So one morning she gets up early, and by herself she leaves her house, she hops in her car, she drives the couple miles down the road, she pulls off onto that shoulder, she parks her car, she hops out, she turns away from the road, she walks into the forest, she finds the stream and starts walking along that animal path right to the side of the stream. She walks for a few minutes until she reaches the point where the trail kind of cuts to the left, and she just stays on the stream and is just continuing walking along the stream. And about 30 minutes later, when she was maybe 1 or 2 miles short of the east-west running river, she hears a bell somewhere off in the distance, way out in front of her, out towards the river. It sounds just like a chime, a single chime. And as soon as she hears it, she stops because there's never any people out out here ever, and that bell sound came from somewhere in the forest. And so she stops because she's not really sure if she actually heard that, because it could have just been her mind playing tricks on her or something. And so she stops and just kind of listens for a second, and then she starts to hear this bell just continuously start ringing. Now, the ringing was not uniform. It was constant, but it was kind of sporadic, as if you were holding a bell and kind of ringing it randomly, like you might see at a sports game. And so she's thinking to herself, is there a dog that got lost somewhere up ahead and it's got a bell on its collar, and that's the sound I'm hearing? But as she's sitting there listening to this kind of sporadic bell sound, she's thinking, that's way too loud to be some rinky-dink bell on a pet's collar. So it's got to be something more robust. Did maybe somebody have a bell inside of a box, and that box got on the river and it's floated down river and it's like crashing into rocks or something? I mean, she's going through these very strange scenarios in her head, but she's not concerned about the bell. She's actually pretty intrigued. And since the sound of this bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already traveling, she decided she would just keep on walking and hopefully see whatever it was that was causing this bell sound. And so Bella just began walking along the stream again, kind of listening to this bell and thinking about what it was going to be. And after about 5 minutes of her starting to walk again, the bell just stops. It goes totally silent. And when it does, it actually kind of startles Bella, because she'd been listening to it so intently. And so she stops and she's listening, kind of expecting it to go off some more, but it doesn't. All she hears are the sounds of nature all around her. Now, Bella didn't have an explanation for what the spell was or why it stopped, but she really just wasn't that worried about it. She figured there was some sort of explanation for it. There had to be. And so she just kind of shrugged and kept on walking and put her focus back on getting to the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still walking along the stream. She was still maybe a half mile or a mile short of the east to west running river when she sees up ahead on the left side of the stream, as she's walking, there appears to be something laying on the ground that looks like it could be an animal or a rock. She doesn't really know what it is. And as she gets closer, she realizes it's a beaver laying on the ground, and this beaver is missing its head. Now, this is a huge forest, and Bella would have known that, of course, there are wild animals all over the place, and so finding the body of an animal that had been attacked by another animal was not unusual. That's nature. But what did strike Bella as odd was the cut on this beaver's neck was unbelievably neat and uniform, as if its head had been very carefully removed with a very sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere to be found. It certainly did not have the appearance of having its head removed from some predator and its teeth. That would have been very rough. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was intact. So whatever killed this beaver was not interested in eating the beaver. As Bella stood over this beaver and was just staring at it, she also noted that there was no smell. Normally, when something dies, it begins to smell very quickly. It's part of the decomposition process. And so for there not to be a smell indicated to Bella that this beaver must have been killed fairly recently. And then when Bella kind of gently prodded the body with her foot, she realized the beaver's body was still fairly limp. So rigor mortis had not set in. Rigor mortis is another part of the decomposition process where the body kind of stiffens up, and that happens fairly soon after death. And so as Bella is realizing this beaver must have died very recently, it dawns on her that most likely whoever or whatever has killed this beaver is probably somewhere nearby. And Bella can't help but connect this dead beaver to that bell she was hearing earlier, which before meant nothing, but considering the bell was roughly coming from the same area where this beaver has now been found, it made her uneasy. And so Bella found herself whipping her head around, looking out into the trees, seeing if, there's some person, a hunter or somebody that would kind of explain what was going on, but there was nothing. And so Bella felt herself starting to panic a little bit, but then she stopped herself and said, "Calm down. It's broad daylight. I have been coming to these woods for years and years. I've never seen another person. I've never encountered some predatory animal. I'm sure everything is perfectly fine. I got nothing to worry about." And so she stepped over the beaver and kept on walking. Bella would eventually reach the east-west running river. She would turn left and walk for 20 minutes alongside this river. She'd reach the man-made lake. She enjoyed the beautiful view and the scenery. And then at some point she turned around and began retracing her footsteps. She walked past the beaver on the ground all the way back to her car, and she went home. A week later, Bella was sitting around her house when she felt pretty bored and decided kind of abruptly that in order to cure her boredom, she would go back to the place she loved so much, the man-made man-made lake. And so she told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house, hopped in her car, drove to the pull-off and parked and entered the woods at 6 p.m. Sunset that night was at 9 p.m. and so Bella knew this would need to be a fairly quick turnaround so she didn't get trapped in the woods in the dark. And so Bella finds the animal trail. She follows along the stream until the trail goes left and she stays on the stream. She continues walking on the stream when she starts to hear the distant sound of thunder. And so she looks up into the sky through the trees and she can see the sky is starting to get dark, but she's still a couple of hours away from sunset. And so between the thunder and the dark skies, she knows a storm is rolling in. But she is determined to get to that lake. And so instead of, turning around and saying, okay, I'll come back another time, she just starts jogging along the stream to get there as fast as she possibly can. And almost immediately as she's jogging, the raindrops start to fall. And by the time she passes the beaver corpse on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. And then about 15 minutes after the corpse, when she hit the east-west running river, that's when the rain was at a full downpour. Still, Bella turned at the river and continued west towards the man-made lake as if she was going to go all the way, but only about a minute or two into this final leg. She still had about 20 minutes to get to the lake. She stops herself and she looks at her watch and she can see it's after 8 o'clock already. And she's thinking to herself, if I turn around right now, it's going to take me over an hour to get back to my car. Sunsets at 9 p.m. It's after 8 p.m. now. So already I know I'm going to have to navigate this forest at night in the dark, even if it's just for a little bit at the end. And if I go all the way to the lake and then come all the way back to the car, I'm going to be in the forest after dark for quite a while, maybe up to an hour. And she's thinking, I'm confident I can do that, but it's also pouring rain, I'm cold. If I get lost, this could turn into a very bad situation. And so she ultimately decides that even though she really wants to keep going, she needs to turn around, she needs to head back. And so she turns around and she walks back up alongside this east-west running river to where the stream fed into that river. She turns and begins walking south along this stream, headed back towards the car. On her walk, because the visibility was starting to get quite bad because it was so dark, she had her head down at the ground because she didn't want to trip. She's stepping on rocks, she's stepping on muddy areas. She wants to make sure her footing is solid. And so her head is down, the rain is pounding all around her, and she's walking for about 15 minutes when all of a sudden something hits her in the top of the head. And so reflexively, she looks up and kind of puts her hands in front of her face to protect herself, and she sees what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string that was dangling off a branch right above her. And this beaver's head had been retrieved and the head had been stitched onto the front paws of this beaver. And so she's looking at this beaver that's dangling from this rope. It's carrying its own head and she's walked square into it. And her first reaction was basically to gag. She was going to vomit. She was so disgusted. And then she began frantically rubbing at her hair where this thing had made contact with her because there could be juices from the decomposition that got on her. And then after frantically kind of patting at her head for a second, she stops and something really terrifying dawns on her. Whoever strung this beaver up to this tree and then stitched its head onto its paws, they had done that in the last 30 minutes because 30 minutes earlier when she was on her way in, she remembered passing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It had not moved from where it was the week before when she first saw it. And now this beaver is strung up in the tree. And so as the wheels are turning in Bella's head, she realizes that if someone has just done this, then they are probably nearby. And at this point, it's really starting to get dark. The rain is pounding all around her. And she starts whipping her head around, looking in all directions to see if there's someone out there that did this. But as she's looking, all she sees is just dark forest in all directions. And she knows she's at least 1 hour, even if she runs from her car. And so suddenly she is totally panicked. And in an effort to calm herself down, she says to herself, okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running right now, this is going to turn into a complete nightmare. I just have to try to walk. And so she walks around this dangling beaver corpse and starts walking along the stream. And as soon as she's past that corpse, she feels the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She can hear movement behind her. She doesn't know what it is. It could be a deer, it could be some animal, but she's too afraid to turn around. And even though she was trying to tell herself to calm down, just keep walking, you're safe, you're freaking yourself out, everything is okay, as she's walking, she could feel herself starting to speed up until finally she was just running down this stream, sprinting actually away from this beaver and whatever it was that was moving around in that area. And at some point, she got so winded from sprinting so fast that she came to a stop, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing this beaver. And as soon as she comes to a stop and she's walking, she still hasn't turned around yet, she hears the sound of that bell. And right away, it's the exact same sound she had heard the week before. It's that kind of constant, sporadic sound of someone ringing a bell. But in her panic state, she doesn't know where it's coming from. She's so scared. Her anxiety is so high. She doesn't know if it's behind her or if it's off to the side. It's now completely dark out. And so she is full-blown terrified. There is someone or something behind her that has strung this beaver up that's probably watching her, and she can't see them. Even though she's beyond winded, she can barely breathe, she just starts sprinting as fast as she can. And as she's stumbling and falling on the rocks and tripping because she's not really looking where she's going, in the background and all around her, she's hearing this bell chiming and she's hearing something moving around in the woods behind her. And she pulls her phone out of her pocket, her iPhone, and as she's running, she dials her father. She puts the phone to her ear. She's crying. She's panting. She can barely breathe. Her father picks up and she's so relieved to hear his voice, but she can't even make a sentence. She just starts crying and wailing and pleading with him. Dad, come out to the forest. Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest that's chasing me and I can't see them. Her father on the other end of the phone, he didn't know what to make of this, but he could hear the primal fear in his daughter's voice. And so he didn't ask any questions. He said, stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now. So Bella's father and mother, with Bella on the line, they run out of their house. They hop in their car. They speed the couple miles down the road. They park next to their daughter's car. And as they're running into the woods, they can hear way off in the woods the sound of the bell. They can hear the bell. They hear their daughter screaming on the phone. They can hear the bell coming through the phone, and she's begging them to please come into the woods, come in here, save me. And so the parents run into the woods and they begin running up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella, who's way out in the woods, she's still 10 or 15 minutes away from her parents. She is barely able to run at this point. She's exhausted almost all of her energy, and as she's getting closer and closer to her parents, the sporadic bell sound is getting louder and louder and louder, like whatever it is gaining on her. And she can hear behind her all these sticks and branches. They're breaking as if something is coming up to her. And finally, when it feels like this bell is right behind her head, she just kind of stops in defeat. She's too far away from her parents. She can't get to them in time. And so it was almost like she had to turn around and finally look at whatever it was that was behind her. And so terrified beyond words, Bella, who can barely breathe, she's so scared and so tired, she slowly turns around. Now, when she turns around and she's facing the other direction, she's looking across this clearing. She just happened to run past this clearing, and because it was a clearing, there was a little bit of moonlight that was coming down through the trees, just enough to illuminate this space that was about 50 feet wide. And as she's looking across this clearing, at first, she doesn't see anything. And then this tall, dark figure walks into the clearing, and as soon as it steps in, she can see it's got a bell at its waist. And with every step it took, it would violently ring the bell, causing the ringing sound. And so this thing starts moving into the clearing, and as Bella is staring at it, it was like time slowed down. She could not process what she was looking at. She didn't know what she was looking at. All she knew is whatever or whoever this is, they're coming straight at me. And so Bella suddenly got this unbelievable adrenaline rush. It was like her body went into autopilot to save her, and she turned around and began sprinting faster than she'd ever sprinted in her life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now knew represented steps this thing was taking. And so the bell was getting faster and faster and louder, and she knew it was gaining on her. And she began lying and screaming out loud that, I'm on the phone with the police, they're right up ahead, they're gonna be here any moment. But whatever it was that was behind her, they weren't fazed. They were just charging ahead, gaining on her second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot, but her father, he felt like, I can't just sit here. And he just starts charging into the woods. He can hear his daughter screaming. He can hear this bell getting louder and louder. He just starts running towards it. And sure enough, seconds later, he sees his daughter come bounding out of the forest, and she leaps into his arms. He just grabs her, turns around, and runs with her back to the meeting spot. He grabs his wife, and the three of them just charge out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back in their car, and they speed off. In the car, all of them are crying. They don't know what to make of what just happened. Bella's trying to describe it, but she can't. And her parents, they had been on the phone listening to their daughter screaming, and all they kept saying to each other, the parents, was, I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell. As if the bell confirmed their worst nightmares, that there really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to do harm to their child. They would drive straight to the police station where Bella would file a report about what she experienced out in the forest. And then afterwards, her parents, as a precaution, took her to the hospital where she was determined to be okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling down. The following morning, the police went out to the forest, to the area where Bella had explained where she had been, and they searched all along that animal foot trail and all along the stream, but they never found any sign of this dark figure with the bell. Bella would tell police that she had a handbag, and as she was running back, she dropped the bag. She remembered where she dropped it along the stream, but when the police went to that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It was not tied up to the tree, it was not on the ground, it was gone. The only thing police found that was out of the ordinary was they found a little ways off from the stream, basically along the path that Bella would have been running on, they found a t-shirt neatly folded placed underneath a rock. But the police and Bella and her family have no idea what that signifies. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she ran into was some kind of mentally unstable person that was living out in the woods, and perhaps when Bella came into the woods, they felt like she was on their property, and so they kind of tried to scare her off. But Bella has a hard time accepting that. She felt like, as she was running from whoever was behind her, that she was in mortal danger. That had it not been for her father running into the woods and literally grabbing her and running with her the rest of the way, that she may not have gotten out of the woods at all, that she might have been attacked and killed by whoever this was. She also can't help, when she looks back at the entire experience, thinking about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing and saw this figure come into the moonlight for the first time, that when it came into the moonlight, the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal, they were abnormal. There was just something off about this thing's movement, that it didn't seem like she was looking at a person, but rather some big animal. But regardless, since her ordeal, there have been no strange sightings out in those woods. However, almost no one ever goes in those woods except for Bella and her family, and Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there.